I remember standing in my half-garage workshop on a Saturday morning, coffee getting cold on a stack of scrap wood, while I tried to figure out why two perfectly measured boards still wouldn't line up. The sound of the saw had already stopped, not because I was done, but because I didn't know what to cut next. The plan on the bench looked professional, but every step felt like a guess, and that moment hit harder than the mistake itself. The silence after realizing the project wasn't going anywhere, that feeling most people recognize it instantly. And here's the uncomfortable question nobody really asks. Whether the problem isn't your skill, but the instructions you're trusting in the first place? Most people in that position assume the issue is them. Not enough experience, not enough precision, not enough tools. But after looking closely at thousands of woodworking projects and plans, a pattern shows up that's hard to ignore. There's an entire ecosystem built around what I call incomplete plans. Diagrams that look polished, instructions that sound professional, but were never fully tested in a real workshop from start to finish. And here's what makes it worse. Once a plan is published, very few people ever verify whether it actually works in real-world conditions. It just gets copied, sold, downloaded, and reused. Over time, small errors get baked into something that looks trustworthy on paper, but falls apart the moment what hits the table saw. I've spent years around both beginner and experienced woodworkers, and I've seen the same pattern repeat enough times that it stops feeling random. It starts feeling systemic. Let's break down what that actually looks like in real life. First scenario. You decide to build something simple, a small end table. Nothing complicated. You find a plan that looks clean, maybe even professional. You buy the lumber. You clear your weekend. And then halfway through cutting, something subtle happens. A joint doesn't align the way the diagram suggested. A measurement that looked precise on paper doesn't account for real material thickness. And this is where most people make a mistake that costs them months. They assume they misread something. So they start overthinking every cut, every angle, every decision. By the end of the day, the project is either abandoned or pushed into a corner of the garage. And the internal thought is always the same. I must be doing something wrong. But the truth is simpler. The instructions were never fully validated in a real build sequence. Second scenario. You try something bigger this time. A storage bench or maybe a workbench upgrade. The materials list seems fine at first glance. But once you start building, you realize something important. It doesn't match reality. You're missing hardware. You're short on lumber. You're making extra trips to the store that weren't part of the plan. And what nobody tells you about woodworking plans is that small omissions don't feel small in the middle of the build. They break momentum completely. So now your Saturday turns into logistics instead of building. And your Sunday becomes a recovery day instead of progress. And you start thinking, maybe this just takes more experience than you have. But that's not the real issue. The real issue is that the plan assumed things you were never told to verify. Third scenario. You stop trusting single plans altogether and start searching endlessly. You go through forums, PDFs, random project sites, Pinterest boards. You find pieces of ideas, not complete systems. And this is where frustration builds differently, not from failure, but from overload. You end up stitching together parts of different plans just to make one project work. Sometimes it succeeds. Sometimes it doesn't. But either way, it's exhausting. And after enough cycles of searching, building, fixing, and restarting, the thought changes from, can I build this? To, is this even worth the time? And that shift is dangerous because it quietly ends momentum. And here's what all three of these situations have in common. They don't come from lack of effort or tools or interest. They come from the same root issue, instructions that were never fully built, tested, and verified as complete systems before reaching you. That's the hidden gap most people never see. After you've been through that cycle enough times, something interesting happens. You stop looking for better plans and start looking for something more reliable, not more complex, not more advanced, just something that has already been built correctly before it ever reaches your hands. That's where the shift begins. A different approach to woodworking plans isn't about more detail. It's about verification. Every step needs to connect. Every measurement needs to match real material dimensions. Every build sequence needs to be tested in practice, not just drawn on paper. When that happens, The experience changes in a very specific way. The frustration from mismatched joints disappears because the joints were already built successfully before you ever saw them. The materials confusion fades because the list isn't theoretical. It's derived from actual construction. And the endless searching stops because you're no longer assembling fragments of information. You're following complete builds. There's a real example that stuck with me. A woodworker with a half-garage setup, limited space, basic tools, took on a small cabinet project. In the past, something like that would have taken weeks of stops and restarts. But with a fully tested plan, it became a straightforward process. Cut, assemble, adjust, finish, not because the skill changed, but because the uncertainty was removed. And that's the part most people underestimate. At this point, most people still have one hesitation. Even if this works, is it actually practical for my situation? Not everyone has a full workshop. Not everyone has professional grade tools. And a lot of people have already been burned by planned collections that promise simplicity but delivered chaos. That concern is valid. But in real use cases, what stands out isn't complexity, it's structure. One woodworker I looked at had been stuck on small weekend projects for years. Nothing ever fully finished. Too many missing steps, too many abandoned builds. When he switched to a structured, tested system of plans, he didn't suddenly become more skilled. He just stopped getting stuck mid-process. Another case involved someone working in a very limited space, essentially half of a single-car garage. Instead of trying to force large projects, they focus on smaller builds designed for constrained environments. The difference wasn't the workshop, it was the clarity of instructions. Across both cases, the outcome was the same. Fewer mistakes, fewer abandoned projects, more completed builds. And the reason is simple. When a plan is already built and verified before you receive it, you're no longer experimenting. You're executing. That changes everything. If nothing changes over the next few months, most people stay in the same cycle. A project gets started, runs into confusion, gets pushed aside. Another gets attempted, runs into missing steps, gets abandoned. The garage slowly fills with half-finished ideas instead of completed work, not because of lack of effort, but because every attempt requires you to solve problems that should have already been solved. But if even one thing changes, if the instructions you follow are complete, tested, and structured, then the entire experience shifts. Projects stop feeling like puzzles and start feeling like execution. And it's worth saying this clearly. If you've already been doing the hard part, showing up, building, trying again, then the missing piece was never effort. It was clarity. Looking back, most failed projects aren't failures at all. They're evidence of persistence in an environment that wasn't giving complete guidance. And once that changes, the process becomes noticeably simpler, not easier, just more direct. If you're curious about what a fully structured set of woodworking plans actually looks like in practice, I left a reference in the description. If this resonated with you, subscribe to the channel. And I'd genuinely like to know, what's the last project you started but never finished?